Okay, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to begin the seminar tonight. I'm joined by Akhil Amar, Sterling Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. Tonight we're going to talk about the pardon power. The format is Akhil and I are going to speak for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions through the Q&A function. Try and make your questions askable. So make them, short to the point. I'd like to have the opportunity to field as many questions as possible. And so again, submit those through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then the final thing is I'd like just to thank Pam Green and Rick Harrison, the ISPS, my ISPS colleagues who helped to set up and publicize this event. So let me get started. Akhil, welcome. And my first question for you, we're just going to lay the groundwork for the questions. My first question for you is basically, could you tell me a little bit of pardon, U.S. Constitution Pardon Power 101? What is the pardon power? What are its limits? And what is the rationale for giving the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons?
So this is in the Constitution. It's in Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the article setting out the powers and the role of the president. Article 1 is the legislature. Article 2 is the presidency. Article 3 is the judiciary. I'm sounding a little like constitutional rock, you know. I'm just a bill staying on Capitol Hill. And the pardon power is quite sweeping, but it has some limits, explicitly and implicitly. It's a power vested in the president and the president alone, in one person. It's a power that applies to all federal offenses, but not state offenses. And it's a power that operates in the criminal law domain, and it's not a power to spare someone of a civil penalty. Deportation, for example, if you're not an American citizen, that's not a criminal punishment. That's a civil consequence. It does not apply to people who are in the impeachment process. So the president can't spare, let's say, a cabinet officer or a judge, for that matter, from being impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate. Now, that process, that impeachment process, which is a federal process, a criminal process of sorts, doesn't result in someone being imprisoned or losing their life. It at most means someone's going to be removed from office and disqualified, but the president's power doesn't apply to the impeachment process. President can't pardon for a crime that has yet to occur. He can only pardon for past crimes. He can say every day, I hereby pardon everyone who has violated the federal drug laws today. Oh, and I expect to make the same proclamation tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. But it can't be prospective. I can't pardon for a crime yet to occur, but only past crimes. And again, only federal. A president, in my view, and in the views of most of us, can't pardon himself. No one can be a judge in his or her in their own case. Those are basically, I think, the parameters. These can be contradistinguished, Alan, from the rules in England, where in England, for example, there is no federalism thing, so the king can pardon just sort of for everything. And even in England, because impeachment is a more criminal process in England that can result in all sorts of additional punishments, the king has more sweeping power in impeachment situations. I'm an originalist, and here I end. I construe constitutional text through a historical prism. And for me, it's very useful in dealing with this clause of the Constitution or any other to look at the historical background to compare the president's power with two obvious baselines. How did England do it? In this case, how does this compare to the king? And how do the states do it? And in a nutshell, this power is close to the king's and much, much more sweeping than gubernatorial power at the state level then and even now. But they knew what the state constitutions were. They knew what the English traditions and system was, and they're crafting, they being the framers, these rules against the backdrop of all of that.
Great. Yeah, no, this sounds like one of these like royal prerogatives a little bit in the Constitution. In the Constitution, it's just laid out very sparely what the pardon power is. It comes without an explanation or justification of the pardon power, if I recall. But it's there, and I guess you're saying it's in some ways implicit because of the history of the common law practice of the royal prerogative of mercy, or that was sort of the background of it. What are the rationales for this power and lodging this power in the executive?
The Constitution is a terse text because actually it's ratified by ordinary people, so they tried to keep it short. It was designed so that it could be reprinted start to finish in newspapers, and it was from day one. And part of that terseness is often not telling us why. Do this, don't do that. There are only about 3 or 4 clauses really that tell us why. The preamble of the Constitution sets forth overall purposes: forming a more perfect union, common defense, general welfare, blessings of liberty, domestic tranquility. So the preamble gives us some overarching purposes. They're in the clauses that talk about taxing and spending. They say, oh, that's for the general welfare and common defense. So there's that. There's a clause that gives Congress powers for patents, and it says, oh, this is to encourage actually authors and writers. And the Second Amendment actually says, this is in order to further the purposes of a well-regulated militia, which is necessary to the security of a free state. I think I've given you almost all the why clauses of the Constitution. They're few and far between. So this one doesn't tell us why, but again, I'm an originalist, that the people who are encouraging their fellow citizens to vote yes actually give reasons. Most famously in a series of newspaper op-eds that were later bound together in a book called that we call the Federalist. Something we call it the Federalist Papers, but this was the essays of Publius or the Federalist. And Hamilton, who theorizes the executive branch more than the others. Publius is actually a pseudonym for 3 real people. It's almost half Hamilton, almost half Madison, and a few essays by Jay, 85 in all. And here's what he actually says. So Akhil in a book, Akhil, that would be yours truly. I'm starting to sound like Bob Dole, referring to myself in the third person, or Ricky Henderson. I wrote this book. It's called America's Constitution, a biography. It's a big fat book, but it's very inexpensive. You can get it, on Amazon for $13 in paperback or something. And I try to tell the reader not just the what and the how of every provision of the Constitution, but also the why. Now, let me just read a little passage from it, and cribbing from Hamilton. But here are my 3 big themes in the book. This is actually what the Constitution is really all about. More than we've been taught, it's about national security and geography and borders and boundaries, therefore, defense, common defense, way more than we've been taught. It's about self-government, democracy. It wasn't anti-democratic, it's pro-democratic. And it's about slavery, alas. And then it's going to get amended to take the slavery part out. The pardon is very much connected to national security at its core. Okay, so I'm going to read you Hamilton, but just before I do, just translating him into modern lingo, there's an insurrection going on. And at all times, you have a president, one person, 24/7, 365. The House goes in and out of session, and it's multi-member. The courts go in and out of session. There is always a president. In England, we say the king is dead, long live the king. There's not a nanosecond between the death of one monarch and the ascension of another. It's executive power is sleepless. It's continuous. It always has to exist. And that's because there's a crisis that could exist at any moment, and they're imagining especially an insurrection. And here's the idea that if you have one person, they can actually at any moment say, listen, what's done is done. What you've done is completely improper. But if you lay down your arms immediately and you disperse and you go home peacefully, and you don't resume this, you will be spared. You will be pardoned. All will be forgiven. This offer is good for, and then fill in the blank, 30 minutes, 3 hours, 1 day. So here's actually, and that can spare massive bloodshed if effectively used. This pardon in the right hand at the right time could actually really, be very helpful for the Republic. So here's actually what Hamilton writes. This is Federalist number 74. And since this is a largely Yale audience, this is all on a Yale website called Avalon. This is your alumni contributions at work. So just look up Federalist 74 Avalon, and you can actually read along with me. And here's what Hamilton says in the Federalist 74. In seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth. Okay, and then because, quote, the loss of a week, a day, an hour may sometimes be fatal, any dilatory process of convening the legislature or council might let slip the golden opportunity. So that's why, there's just maybe not time for one person to convene a body and get their pre-approval for this. That's his argument about why this has the structure it does.
Interesting. Okay. And if I recall, the section of Article 2 that the pardon power is in also speaks of the power of the commander in chief. Is that right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
absolutely. And now you're seeing how these things fit together.
Yeah.
And now this isn't the only purpose of the pardon, but this is the one that explains why it's so immediate and peremptory and one person. Now,
is that how it's been? I guess is that how it's been used, Akhil?
In the first and most
rebellion.
important. Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Please.
And in fact, what I say in this is, in this vivid passage, whose script President Washington would closely follow in dissolving the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, Hamilton deftly interwove several of the threads that define America's presidency: the sleeplessness and unity of executive power, the president's unique capacity for quick, decisive action, and this officer's special role in handling crises that might threaten the national tranquility or even the national existence. So what Washington does is follow this script to a T. There's a lot of discontent in the back country. They don't like paying taxes on whiskey. Now, they're going to get something for that. They're going to get a government that's going to actually pacify the Indian tribes and help them in all sorts of ways. But, they're upset. This is totally different than the colonists in the early 1770s, late 1760s, because Parliament is imposing all sorts of stuff on them, and they can't vote the bums out of office. And they didn't pick a king. Well, here they picked a president, and if you don't like him, vote him out of office. They're picking Congress. If you don't like him, vote the bums out. There are reasons we have taxes. There's a tax on whiskey. Oh, but the people don't like it. Washington summons overwhelming force, 10 to 15,000 people in a militia. He gets on his horse, puts his uniform back on, and rides out to the west with Hamilton actually at his side. So two Revolutionary War officers reunited. And when he's assured that, and then actually things are looking at, and at a certain point he turns around, but he tells Hamilton and Light Horse Harry Lee to carry forward. They issue a proclamation: lay down your arms and you will be forgiven. 90%, 95% of the rebels, after pissing their pants, actually run away and are never heard from again. And that's the first part of this. And bloodshed was spared because he used overwhelming force and then a perfectly timed act of mercy. But then a second aspect of the pardon emerged. A few diehards, so to speak, did not actually surrender. They persisted. They were captured. Several of them were tried. A couple of them were actually convicted of treason or its equivalent and sentenced to death. And now a second aspect of the pardon came into operation. George Washington, as an act of supreme mercy and from a position of great strength, spared them, in part because he thought one of them was maybe a little bit, not quite right in the head, and partly because he's not a vengeful fellow. There's a reason that Americans picked him. He's actually a pretty virtuous guy. Slavery is complicated, but he does free his slaves. So now, Alan, I've given you two different paradigm, and these aren't the only ones, but two different paradigmatic examples. One, the national security example, the other, the pure mercy example, and third, maybe actually the guy was innocent in a certain way. Maybe he committed the act, what lawyers call actus reus, but maybe he didn't really have the requisite mens rea, the requisite mental state. And yes, a jury did convict him, and yes, a judge did preside over the thing, but maybe actually, and it's possible, and this is yet another thing, evidence has come to light to Washington after the trial about this one fellow's mental state. So here are now several other purposes of the pardon. As just an act of pure mercy and grace. Maybe you're innocent, and maybe it's because of evidence that came to light after the conviction itself. So these aren't the only reasons for pardon. I'll give you some more, but now we've already just in this episode, which is the first one, you're seeing good pardons at work in the hands of a very good president. I argue in another book that I wrote called The Words That Made Us, the Constitution is written in effect by Washington for Washington. The idea that James Madison is the father of the Constitution is preposterous. George Washington is the father of the Constitution, and that's why it has a really, really strong presidency, because he drafts it by, in effect, he gets what he wants. If you want me to be president, this is what, I'm going to need. It's a very strong presidency, much stronger pardon power than almost any state governor has, but they, don't have national security responsibilities. So therefore, some of the things that Washington does help gloss the naked text, which doesn't tell us all the whys and wherefores. And so if we're really trying to think seriously about pardon, read his words, compare it to England, compare it to the state constitutions, but also look very carefully at what Washington did on this issue and many other issues. Final thought on that. Can presidents fire cabinet officers at will? Yes, they can. That's 9-0 in today's Supreme Court. Oh, but the text doesn't make that clear. Washington's practices made that clear. So on many an issue, even today, constitutional lawyers look not just at what the text says, but what Washington did.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't want to go off on this tangent, but in your explanation, the national security example does explain, I think, quite clearly why you might want to lodge this in the executive relatively unchecked. The mercy, actual innocence, because the elements of the crime don't appear to be present despite the jury, whatever it might be. Those I don't think have the same level. They might have some rationale for having the executive do it, but it would be a different one from the urgency justification.
You're absolutely right, but some of the mercy might be acts of national unity and reconciliation.
Agreed.
Jimmy Carter, pardoning the draft dodgers. Andrew Johnson, don't love Andrew Johnson,
Yeah.
but the pardon used to basically and Lincoln would have done the same thing, and maybe not quite so promiscuously, in order to knit the country back together. And those are,
I think Gerald Ford gave that as a justification for the
for
Nixon
Nixon,
pardon.
and those are raison d'etat, reasons of state that you might not want to give to just some little bureaucratic board. They're kind of high.
Well, they wouldn't have the same symbolic resonance if it was granted. Even if it was the same outcome, it still would not serve the purpose.
Now here's yet another one. It's not implicated by Washington's pardons, but the pardon power has also been used because a president might believe the statute is unconstitutional. So now let's take the next really important set of pardons. So we have the text, and the text doesn't give us all the whys and wherefores. I read you the Federalist Papers. They give you the national security rationale. I told you about the Whiskey Rebellion that elaborates that. The next big pardon in America is for the violations of the Sedition Act, because John Adams signs a bill into law that makes it a crime to criticize John Adams. And and lots of people think this is preposterous. And by the way, just for the record, John Adams is a pretty decent fellow, but he is a Harvard man. Just remember that. Okay. And Woodrow Wilson is going to be very thin-skinned in World War I, going after his critics. And just remember, he's a Princeton man. Actually, the better person on this is William Howard Taft. Just saying, for the Yaleys out there, that the Taft is better on this than Wilson and John Adams. That's only partly kidding. But when Thomas Jefferson sweeps into office, he pardons everyone who was convicted under the Sedition Act, and he does so. And there's a letter. You can find the letter in 5 seconds. There's a thing called the National Archives Founders Online. Has every letter ever written to or from the most important founders, and it's word searchable. It's your tax dollars at work, at least when we used to pay taxes and get government services, back in the old days. But he writes a letter to Abigail Adams, who was angry at his doing this. He says, I had to do it. It's an unconstitutional statute, in my view. It's no law at all. Judges have the power of judicial review, but if they're not going to actually strike down, nullify this improper, these prosecutions, it falls to me as president to do that. Okay. And again, you might not want to give that just to a board of bean counters or pardon people, because this is a very consequential constitutional decision coming from someone who has the requisite mandate, one might argue, to do that, having been elected by the American people. So now we've just gone through just the early precedents, and you're beginning to see, oh, there are different kinds of pardons, they have different sizes and shapes. Final point, which I should have said earlier. What's the big check on this? Because it can very much be abused if, for example, you have a president, he encourages all of his followers to violate the law, I can flip this thing around, to go and attack enemies, and then shall kill his opponents. Shall no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? Okay, and then when they do just that, he pardons them all. And some people would say, that's not a hypothetical, Akhil. That's January 6th. Okay, other people might contest that. So it's a power that's capable of great abuse, even though you might think it's just a power of doing nothing at all. But if you're encouraging people to commit crimes, your followers, and then giving them, a get out of jail free card at the end of the day, oh, that's not so good. And remember, the pardon can issue even before indictment, trial, conviction, sentence. Even it has to be after the crime, but in the Whiskey Rebellion, it's before any sort of trial. What's the big check then? Because some people say, oh, it's not really a power to do dangerous things. It's just the power to spare people. Yeah, but you encourage them to commit crimes and then you give them a free pass. That is very dangerous. The big check is twofold. It's publicity, and pushback. We see this and we're repelled by it, and we vote against that president or that president's party or that president's, would-be successor, and ultimately impeachment. Those are the big checks on promiscuous and improper and corrupt uses of the pardon power.
Good. So let me, Akhil, so a couple things. First, I want to encourage our audience to submit questions through the Q&A. There are a couple questions there, and I'd like to get some more so that we take full advantage of the opportunity to interact with our speaker. Let me ask one other question. Maybe this is a segue. So you've told us a bit about the early history of the use of the pardon, bringing us up to the current period. There's been controversies regarding the recent presidential pardons by Biden as well as by Trump. Do you want to say a little bit? Are these business as usual? It's just we're very forgetful about all of the things that happen in our history. These are very ordinary things. Or do they break new ground? What new ground do they break? If they do break new ground, either in magnitude or in type? And what is your general sense about? I mean, I know you could, I suspect, I have extensive remarks on this question, but briefly, what is your assessment of this use of the pardon for
I'm
the?
harshly critical of recent pardons by both President Biden on his way out, first of his son, and then of his brother and sister-in-law and other members of his family, literally hours, minutes before he handed the baton to Trump. Harshly critical of that. And audience members, I have a free weekly podcast, and you could listen to all my reasons for this. The episode, I think I had two episodes because he did two. Well, one of them is called Unpardonable. So you could find this on the internet in 30 seconds. The podcast is called America's Constitution, and I do it with my friend Andy Lipka, who's Yale 78. I'm Yale 80, Yale College. So harshly critical of the Biden pardons, both of his son and other family members later on. Harshly critical of the Trump pardoning promiscuously all these January 6th insurrectionists. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why I think they're bad. But you also asked me, Alan, is this just business as usual? And I say yes and no. These aren't the first stinky pardons that we've seen in American history or even recent American history, but we need to call them out because the check is publicity and ultimately impeachment, congressional oversight. People who do bad things need to be criticized to create proper incentives. Alan's, an incentive oriented political science to create the right ex-ante incentive effects so that the next president doesn't do this. And if you care about your legacy, this is not a way to burnish your legacy to do these stinky things on the way out. See, because what did I say? I said, well, one's an electoral check. That's not going to be so strong when you're a lame duck, you might say, because you're on your way out. Okay. Oh, but maybe your party should pay the price. So on his way out, a graduate of the Yale Law School did something very stinky. His name was Bill Clinton, and he pardoned Mark Rich. And some people think that he financially benefited from that because Mark Rich's wife or ex-wife or something gave a lot of money for the Clinton Library or something like that. It was very stinky. Okay, but it was already on his way out. But I believe that another Yale Law School graduate, Hillary Clinton, actually in effect paid a price for this many years later because when she ran, the Clinton brand was part of her brand, and people did remember that Clinton did stinky things. He did, and Biden did stinky things. So why do I think this the pardon of Hunter was so bad? Because he didn't even ask the lawyers to get involved. He didn't even make Hunter Biden tell us all the bad things that he did. He just said, you're pardoned for everything. Said, well, what did you do? At least, give me an accounting of the bad things that you did. It was there are allegations, at least, that Hunter Biden was doing some corrupt things that added to the family coffers, and so here's what he should have done. If he's worried that his son isn't going to get a fair shake, okay, with the new administration, he should have. That's Alan, your thought. Give it to someone else, a pardon board or something. Set up a process Merrick Garland and say, I'm going to abide by that process. I can't really judge my son. It's too close and personal. My son deserves the same access to pardon as other folks do. So I'm going to set up a process and pre-commit to follow that. He didn't do any of that. And he's personally implicated by at least some of the allegations against his brother and sister-in-law and son. So wow, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but listen to the episode. I unload on the fellow. And I voted for him. And I voted for, Kamala Harris. But my job is as a constitutional scholar to call, out improper uses of constitutional power to create the right incentives. And I'm very harshly critical of the Trump thing because he kind of egged all these people on to do horrible things to attack actually the Capitol, and then lets them off. That's so different than George Washington. He didn't want these people to riot in the Whiskey Rebellion. He wasn't in cahoots with them. It's a totally different situation. Jimmy Carter isn't telling people to dodge the draft and smoke pot or whatever, and then giving them, a free pass. When you, as president, rile people up to commit violent acts in the Capitol building itself, and then you let them all off. Oh, that was very bad, I thought. So I'm very critical. So the pardon power can be abused, and you're seeing some of the characteristics of abuse. One final thing. Since we mentioned kings, Trump has a particularly monarchical view. It's not just he's like Henry VIII, and it's just off with their head. I spare you because I like you and you like me, and I condemn you. This is so pre-modern, okay? And I don't like it when you're sparing your own son, you see, or your own family members. This doesn't seem properly legal, Weberian, regularized, routinized. So you're starting to see, Alan, good pardons for good reasons, bad pardons for bad reasons. We have to, and who in the end makes these determinations? Oh, my fellow Americans listening, to this podcast, that would be you all. And you do that at election time by holding politicians and their allies and their parties accountable. When they do good things, you should vote for them. And when they do bad things, you should punish them or their privies and interests, their parties and allies and successors. That's how the system has to work.
Yeah, okay. So I'm sorry, just one last follow-up question, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. In light of what you just said about the modern use of the pardon and what we've observed in recent days, are you in favor of, do you have any constitutional amendment you'd like to pass or float, or you're happy with the current arrangements and case law that's grown up around it and norms and practices?
Um, it's an imperfect system, but I think actually any proposal they made would probably make it worse. And in the end, the problems, if we have problems, are not with the rules. They're with us as a society. If we're not willing to criticize and punish politically pardons even from our own political friends. So that's why it's important that I, as a constitutional scholar, say, I voted for Biden and this was bad. I voted for Bill Clinton and this was bad. So I think the system is actually a pretty sensible system, and you couldn't actually change some of its features for some of the reasons we're talking about. You could, but that would create other problems and pathologies. But we as a society have to understand how to run the machine that has been created. I'm not sure I can improve the machine, so I have to just talk about how the mechanics need to keep the machine properly running.
I would just say again in conclusion that that the machine that there's a discipline I think called human engineering where machines are built understanding the capacities of the humans, and the quality of the machine it's really an interaction of the machine and the people who operate it
It is.
to judge the machine. But I your exhortations I think are very very, very well taken. Okay, let's go to our colleagues who are asking
And
questions.
Alan, just to
Yeah.
make clear, if it hasn't been, I'm trying to be as nonpartisan as I can here.
Absolutely.
I'm criticizing Trump on one side, and his pathologies were of a certain sort. They were different kinds of reason. I have different sort of criticism of his pardons than Biden's. They were both bad and both stinky. So there are three. So there's Bill Clinton, which is maybe just, he was almost bribed to do it. There was the Biden thing, and maybe there was financial corruption, but also, he shouldn't have done that with his own family members. That was bad. And then there was Trump, who riled people up to attack government and then actually spared them. So those are three different sets of stinky pardons.
Absolutely.
Two from Democrat, and I voted for Bill Clinton, and I voted for Biden, but we have to be willing to say these are bad and shouldn't be done again.
Yeah, I'm trying not to get involved, but I couldn't agree more. Okay, so let's go to our questions. Here's a question. Is there any case law on presidential pardons, including whether or not, let's, I guess, focus on this, including whether or not any careful review by the Justice Department is required?
Right. And I just told you, of course, that cannot be the case because it may need to be instantaneous. And the Justice Department actually, in the Constitution, answers to the president. The Attorney General serves at the pleasure of the president, and that's a constitutional thing. It's called the Decision of 1789, and it's because even though the text of the Constitution is not at all clear on firing, it talks about appointing, but it doesn't talk about firing. The text isn't clear. Oh, and the Federalist Papers say when you're firing folks, you being the president, you're going to need to get the Senate to approve. But 9-0, that's not the case in today's Supreme Court. It's 9-0 in today's Supreme Court that presidents can fire the Secretary of State at will, the Secretary of the Treasury at will, the Attorney General at will, whether that's a secretary who he's inheriting from an earlier administration. You're not stuck, if you're President Trump, you are not stuck with Merrick Garland. But you're not stuck with Pam Bondi either. You're not even stuck with the people that you picked. You get to fire cabinet officers at will. To repeat, that is 9-0 in today's Supreme Court. And that's not clear from the text of the Constitution or the Federalist Papers. It's clear because these are the precedents that George Washington set in 1789 in a series of statutes. They're called the Decision of 1789. And I talk about them in great detail in at least three of my books: America's Constitution, a biography, The Words That Made Us, and America's Unwritten Constitution. You need to know not just the text, but what Washington did, especially if you're going to understand presidential power, executive power. And the definitive case that elaborates all of this, that builds on the so-called Decision of 1789, saying presidents get to fire attorneys general at will, and the Justice Department is just below the Attorney General. There's a case, I think it's 1926. It's called Myers versus United States. It's a landmark decision authored by Chief Justice, the only Chief Justice who was also previously President of the United States. And that wasn't even, some would say, his most important position. His most important position was in between being President of the United States. His name was William Howard Taft. In between being President of the United States and Chief Justice of the United States, oh, he was a professor of constitutional law at Yale. He had my job. And so I think that was his, actually, I'm joking, but he writes an opinion as a former president about the powers of, as Chief Justice, the powers of the president. And he elaborates and this Decision of 1789, which is what everyone calls it. And he says, because of the gloss established by George Washington in the first years of the Washington administration, it's utterly clear that cabinet officers are removable at will by the president. So of course he's not bad. It's his Justice Department. And this is why you have to be very careful, my fellow Americans, about who you elect as president. Okay? Do not expect the Justice Department to keep a president in check because they're under him. He's at the apex of the executive branch pyramid. And that's why it's also important to have a good attorney general. And we've had some horrible attorneys general in history. John Mitchell went to prison under Richard Nixon. And Trump initially nominated Matt Gaetz, who's in my view, well, I don't want to be sued for libel or something, but let's just say, gee, he wouldn't be my pick to be in charge of the Justice Department, given that he has a lot of problems complying with the law himself. So thank goodness it wasn't Matt Gaetz. But if you think that the Pam Bondi Justice Department has been very bad, you have to, and she was confirmed by the Senate, but by this much. Okay. And her Justice Department is doing all sorts of things that I find, problematic. But that's why elections are important. And in theory, she's impeachable. And if the Democrats were to regain control of the House, in 2026, you should not be shocked if Trump were impeached for the third time by the House and Bondi might be impeached. Now, they're probably not going to get a conviction in the Senate because that requires 2/3. And you only get 2/3 if you got a lot of Republican buy-in, and we're not seeing that yet. But there are political checks, and Pam Bondi, even if she weren't to be removed, just impeached, she doesn't want that on her tombstone. One of the three attorneys general in history or whatever to have been impeached. So, but you can't expect the Justice Department to do a great job limiting their boss. That's just not quite,
Okay. So
in the
Akil, I was
cards.
just going to say that I don't want to either. There's a number of other questions I'd like to move on to. If we run through the questions, maybe you could spend a minute or two talking about what the ordinary pardon process is like and the role of the Justice Department in sort of vetting those.
We've tried to routinize this.
Yeah.
It began as kind of quasi-monarchical, just like Yul Brynner in The King and I, just whatever he wants, sort of by fiat. But over the years, we've tried to make it more bureaucratic and routinized. There's actually an office. It's called the Office of Pardon Attorney, and ordinarily, in the ordinary case, not in an insurrection or something like that, but someone's already been convicted and they're rotting away and they'd like to, be released. So their lawyers come up with some papers and they don't just call up the president because he's their pal or something. They submit it to this office, which issues a report. It's very bureaucratic and routinized. And I was harshly critical in the Hunter Biden situation that Biden didn't actually go through, the ordinary process. So ordinarily, but these aren't constitutionally required because they work for the president and he gets to decide in the end what he wants. But it's better practice in general, I think, to go. We have a kind of, I'm invoking Max Weber here, a Weberian system. Max Weber, writes about how there's a move from charismatic, very personal power to, a bureaucratic norms of legality. And the pardon begins kind of as charismatic, just the power of the prince who claims a right to rule by, the grace of God or something. And we're moving from that to a more bureaucratic model for ordinary pardons. Again, in an insurrection, there's not time for that.
So one of the questions, I'm not sure this you want to pick up on this or if this is something you know a lot about. Maybe you do. You know a lot about a lot of things. What was the extent of the British monarch's pardon power in the late 18th century? I guess that is related to the originalism points that you were making at the beginning.
Sweeping.
Yeah.
And that was also a world where the quintessential criminal punishment was actually capital punishment. So this is someone, King Henry VIII, has just power of life or death over, his subjects.
Okay. Is there a legal basis for Trump's pardon of a corporation? And I guess this is in reference to, I think, bit something. I can't remember what it is. So I guess Trump pardoned
Corporations can be
corporation.
subject to criminal sanctions. You can't hang a corporation, but you can actually dissolve it, and that is a criminal punishment that is permissible. And and so I can't give you a specific case where a corporation was pardoned, but the scope of the pardon power is generally pretty much coextensive with the scope of the criminal punishment power, and criminal punishment power applies to corporations as such. There is a thing called corporate personhood. corporations actually, they're entitled to due process and proof beyond reasonable doubt. And to repeat, corporations have been criminal defendants. But I'll tell you something fun, Alan. Corporation has no rights against compelled self-incrimination. It's a 1905 case. It starts with H. Hoke versus Hardy or something. I'm blocking it. It's something kind of like that. And part of the reason why, so they have Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure, and it has to be proof beyond reasonable doubt, and they're entitled to a jury trial, but they're not entitled to a right against compelled self-incrimination. And here's part of the reason why. And so you need to know the purposes. You need to know always the why. Part of the reason why is, we have the rule against compelled self-incrimination. Oh, it's very complicated, many different theories, but one theory is it's about protecting the soul of the defendant. Here's the thing. I did something. I did. And if you ask me, I'm going to deny it because that's the natural human tendency. But if I do that, I've just damned my soul because I actually committed a two-bit offense, but now I committed perjury. And in certain religious traditions, that's a mortal sin and not merely a venial sin. And government led me into temptation. Jesus on Sermon on the Mount said, lead us not into temptation. Government tempted me to actually condemn myself. So this was in part about the torture of the soul and all the rest. There are many different theories, but that's one of them. But if that's part of the theory, doesn't apply to corporations because, and I'm not being snarky here, but just true. Corporations have no soul. So in 1905, 1906, the Supreme Court says corporations have many rights of criminal defendants, but not Fifth Amendment self-incrimination rights.
This is you've once again proven to me that I should have been a lawyer. There's I can't think of things that are equally entertaining in the social.
Aren't they fun?
That's so cool.
And I get paid to do this thanks to actually alums. So thank you very much, alums.
Totally great.
This is great.
No,
very grateful to you.
I'm very happy. I have a good deal too. But okay. So let's see. I'm not sure I totally understand this question, but I think I know what they might be getting at. The person says, thoughts on the degradation of the rule of law in conjunction with normalization of, quote, soft, unquote, violence.
Yes, well, that's exactly the the January 6th thing. You're actually encouraging people to commit sort of acts of violence, and then before the fact, and then sparing them the consequences after. That's if you don't love Trump. And on the other side, you can say, oh, these liberal presidents, they are encouraging sort of, what about all the George Floyd protesters and that some of that state law, not federal law, but I don't want to be partisan about this thing. One of the reasons we have pardon power and the lesser included non-prosecution power. Non-prosecution doesn't give me a vested legal right. A successor could go after me, but every day, prosecutors choose not to go after people. Pardon says once you've gotten a piece of paper, no one can go after you after that. Hale versus Henkel. Thank you very much, Rick. Hale versus Henkel. I said it was H versus H, 1906 or so. Yes, that's the Supreme Court case saying corporations don't have rights against compelled self-incrimination. But one reality is we have massive overcriminalization. And the government couldn't go after everyone, even if it wanted to. It doesn't have the resources. But what a totalitarian society it would be if we actually went after everyone. It is today literally a federal crime to have drugs in all sorts of situations. It might not be a state crime, but it's a federal crime. Their laws are still on the books. And when I tell my students this, I say, please, I do not want a show of hands. I do not. So do not raise your hands here, but just think about what happens in every residential college every day, and think about your friends and how many of them technically have violated not just state drug laws, but federal drug laws. And now you see, if anyone were so totalitarian as to prosecute these folks, why an incoming president, I think would want to come and, like Thomas Jefferson, pardon them all. Okay, but that's in part because, well, maybe that's a nonviolent thing. But your question was about soft violence. And should we be looking the other way when people actually are, misbehaving as mobs, whether they're right-wing mobs in the Capitol or left-wing mobs in Minnesota. Okay. Again, I'm trying to be nonpartisan here. Maybe that's part of what's behind the question.
Okay. Why not have an amendment that would require any pardon to also be approved by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Now, just I know that part of your answer will be the urgency of the moment for the national security case, but maybe
Correct.
for the cases that involve the president determines that the elements of a crime have not been
Right.
proven.
And I already gave you two reasons. So it answers itself because in an emergency situation, it won't work. And you say, well, and because if I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to go free, why should I lay down my arms? Okay. But I also told you in Thomas Jefferson's situation, the idiot judges upheld the Sedition Act. Okay, even though it was obviously unconstitutional, and I say all this in my books. I say these were obviously unconstitutional laws by today's understanding, but the judges didn't understand that. Thomas Jefferson did. And I like John Roberts as well as the next person, but he wrote the Trump immunity decision and listened to me on the podcast. Oh, I go ballistic on that. I'm screechy saying this is the worst decision of my lifetime. So they don't always get it right either. I write a piece in the Atlantic saying they made the Constitution itself unconstitutional when they came up with all these immunity rules, for ex-presidents. So there's no magic bullet, my fellow Americans. We haven't always had great chief justices. Here's a famous chief justice. His name is Roger Taney, and he gives us the Dred Scott decision. And oh, I'll take Lincoln in a heartbeat, over Taney. And since I haven't plugged it yet, my most recent book, which is coming out in September, on Constitution Day, is called Born Equal. And it's all about the Constitution between 1840 and 1920. And the Chief Justice is horrible, Roger Taney, and the president is great, Abraham Lincoln, you see. And Lincoln is going to use the power of pardon. He gets killed by Booth, but in his second address, he says, with malice toward none and charity, for all. He's imagining very broad uses of the pardon power. These guys all committed treason, which is a death penalty offense, but he wants to bring America back together. Now, what if the Chief Justice didn't agree with him? He's the guy who's president and is trying to bring the country back together. And so, no, I wouldn't give the Chief Justice. Okay, I'm going to say something. Honestly, it's possible, my fellow Americans, that the Constitution is actually smarter than you are. I know each of you is a Yaley, or most of you, and you think you're so damn smart, but truthfully, I think 10 times before I actually propose an amendment because I believe in the wisdom of crowds. I believe, Alan, in the Condorcet jury theorem, to be technical about the thing. And sometimes, there's wisdom in what a lot of people might think and do, even if none of them is an Einstein. And I think the Constitution is the product of many minds over many years. And so I hesitate to think that I'm going to be able in my own little head in 5 minutes to come up with a better solution. And
Yeah.
here's now hold on, here's another thing. Let's look at what other democracies do. So if you tell me there are other democracies in the world, or their states that have this rule, oh, now I'm actually more interested. But if instead it's just something that popped into your little head, in the course of this discussion, then I'm less interested because if it's such a brilliant idea, I'd expect states to do it and countries to do it. I don't know the answer to whether any state has that rule. But if they did, that would be an argument for taking it seriously. If they didn't, that would be an argument that, gee, maybe there's a reason why that isn't such a great rule.
Okay. To take the bait, is it really so bad that Biden pardoned his family members, given the dangers posed to them by Trump's past and present vengeful approach to politics? So let me stop there in the question. And maybe address the general version of this. Like, what do you think? Is it when you're categorizing pardons as stinky or not stinky, a justification being, I know the political climate and I know the kind of things that people are up to, and I won't necessarily trust either that the justice system will reach the right result in the event the people I'm concerned about are innocent, or the costs of proving their innocence are themselves ruinous. Is
So
that
you've already anticipated some of the things. They're going to
yeah?
get a judge, they're going to get a jury, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, grand jury, all of that. But if you think the process itself is punishment, just having to go through all that, and oh, it's horrible, the expense and the agony it is, then set up, Joe, a process. You saw this coming for months, damn you. Okay, and you could have set up a process in which Merrick Garland was going to make the call or someone else. You didn't do that. You waited to the very end. You told us all you weren't going to do this, and then you did it, twice. The second time, hours before you're handing over power to Trump so that like maybe no one will notice. This was horrible. If actually it was the right call to make, someone else could have made it. It shouldn't have been your call, especially because the allegation is you're partners in crime with these people. Your relatives have been using the Biden name actually to bring in all sorts of money. And Joe, and remember, I voted for you. Like, where did the money come from? You're living pretty well. That that's what the Republicans, your critics, are saying, and you have set up you've done it in the stinkiest way imaginable, and none of that was necessary if there really was a threat to, your family being treated fairly. You could have set up an independent process to do and committed yourself publicly in advance to this. What did he say instead? He said, "You have my word as a Biden that I won't do this," and then he did this. So listen to the podcast episode, and I go on I rant and rave for half an hour about this and check off like the 8 things that he did that were actually really bad. And to repeat, I voted for the guy. I did, because, compared to the alternative. But no, don't make excuses for bad behavior. Don't. This was bad.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll have time for one last question, and I guess think about this, maybe the spirit of this question. Doesn't the arbitrary power of the president to pardon undermine the rule of law in
That's
the
the
name of,
critique.
yeah, in the name of social stability, national security, mercy, whatever it
That
might be?
that's
It's so
that's the critique.
extrajudicial. Yeah, yeah. So do you
Yeah.
want to just riff on that for a minute before we conclude?
That it may not be possible. We believe in these ideas of, perfect equality and the rule of law and Weberian regularity, but it may very well be that, there's also this idea, for example, of mercy, and maybe it's somewhat random and only some people benefit from it and others don't. So it's a nice question whether you want a system where, everyone gets treated equally but brutally, or, at least some people are spared, maybe, in too personal and charismatic a way with one guy making a decision, which is why ordinarily, Alan, the compromise is just the one you began us with, parole board, systems. In the federal system, it's called the Office of Pardon Attorney, which should handle most of the cases. You still might need, to have someone jump in improvisationally when there's in the Whiskey Rebellion situation and all the rest. But the compromise, which has been used around the world in many states, is this idea that we should try to regularize this to some extent, if possible. And I'm sympathetic to that. And my criticism of the Biden pardons is he didn't do any of that, and he had all the time in the world to do it if he had wanted to.
Akhil, I just want to say someone shared in the question and answer that the corporation's name was BitMEX. So
Hmm.
that was what was being referred to, a recent
Okay.
actual
Okay.
case. All
Okay.
right, terrific. So I think we're kind of at the end of our time, but I wanted to leave 1 minute for you to give us a little guidance if we want to. You did a little bit already, but maybe underscore it. Where should we go if we want to learn more about the U.S. Constitution and pardon power? Uh, please give us your recommendations.
Thanks. I have a podcast. It's weekly. There are over 200 episodes. As it turns out, the first episode, we didn't know this was going to be an important day. It was January 6th, 2021. We've only missed 1 week. It's entirely free. It's an hour and a half plus or minus every week. If you're a lawyer, you can get CLE credit for it. It's called America's Constitution. You just put in Akhil Amar podcast, it'll pop up. It's Pan America rather than America. I do it with a friend of mine that I met through Yale Alumni Association, Andy Lipka, and it's totally free. And the books that I've been talking about, they're in most libraries. You don't have to buy them. If you know, I care more that you read them than that you buy them. But we're in an epistemic crisis, my fellow Americans. And the reason we are is everyone's an expert on everything in Twitter, but it's not true. And I claim that I've actually studied these things and I've done my best to not be partisan about the thing. I hope you've heard some of that today. We bring in amazing people to the podcast. We've had Bob Woodward on a couple of times. He's Yale 65. We've had Gary Hart on. We brought in Steve Breyer, for whom I clerked 6 weeks ago. We brought in a very conservative judge from, he's chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals from the 11th Circuit. He's one of the most conservative judges in America. His name is Bill Pryor, and we brought him in last week. That was a FedSoc event. So we're going to, and we don't always have guests, but we're going to try to bring people in from the right and from the left. And we don't do food fights. We actually just try to do just what we've done today, careful Q&A, trying to work through the issues. And to repeat, it's completely free. And I want to thank you all because I'm able to do this because you fund my life, the alums especially. Very grateful to you. And so the books are books that your contributions have helped make possible, and you can get them in any library. The podcast is free. When you come for your reunions or something like that, please come see me. I usually do a reunion events. I'd love to be in touch with. I met my podcast partner, Andy Lipka, through one of these alumni events. So if you want more, I promise there's lots more out there. And finally, I always cite in the books to the strong arguments on the other side. So if you want, I try to make sure that you, the reader, getting the argument on their side. I try to bring people on the podcast just so you hear, what I think is the best version of the argument that might be different from my own.
Fantastic. Akhil, I just want to thank Rick Harrison and Pam Green, our ISPS community members who helped set up this event. Akhil, it's just been a huge privilege to share this hour with you. And thank you so much for your contribution to this discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, be well.